Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So thanks for having me. It's great to be here at Tufts. I want to tell you about an adventure I went on. I want to tell you about the Keystone XL. So I decided to go on a walk following a controversial oil pipeline. And before I began, I had some questions on my mind. Questions like, has climate change, in fact, put our planet on an irreversible path to destruction? If so, what is our duty as individuals up against something so enormous? How far should each of us go to protect our planet? But the question on my mind more than anything was, what am I going to do about all the cows? You see, because I was about to set off on a never done before and sort of illegal hike across the heartland from Hardisty, Alberta, all the way down to the Gulf Coast of Texas, following this Keystone XL pipeline. And pipelines, they don't like roads, they don't follow roads, right? They like to get to their refinery in as few miles as possible. So they go across croplands, they go across grasslands, they go across private property. So this meant that if I wanted to follow this pipeline, I'd have to go across Alberta prairie, Saskatchewan pasture, Montana hills, South Dakota canyons, Nebraska cornfields, and then on down through Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. In order to hike the Keystone XL, I'd essentially have to trespass across America. And this also meant that I'd be walking by thousands and thousands of cows. And as a suburbanite from Buffalo, New York, who knew nothing about cows except that they were bigger than me and faster than me and had horns and gored bullfighters and chased people through Spain, yeah, I was a little nervous about that. So let me tell you about when I had the idea to hike the Keystone XL. It actually wasn't even me who had the idea, it was my buddy Liam. We were living at the time all the way in Dead Horse, Alaska. This is in the middle of the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. We were working in a kitchen. He was the cook, I was the dishwasher. This is Dead Horse right here. It's quite possibly the most miserable place on earth. There's no families there, there's no churches, there's no schools. It's just a lot of men and a lot of equipment. That's all Dead Horse is. And I'm not kidding about the a lot of men thing. The ratio is at least 9 men to every 1 woman. And I can see some of you ladies that are getting excited. You know, I'm going to go up to Alaska and have options. But we have a saying up there, and it's, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. So I'm 28, I'm broke, I'm washing dishes for a living, and I can say from experience when you're 28 and broke and washing spoon after spoon in the middle of the night in a silent kitchen 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, you begin to question the direction your life is headed in a little bit. But I can also say this from experience, and that's the soul must be caged before it can be set free. And I know that sounds really corny, but I believe it. Because it's in our worst moments of meaninglessness, purposelessness, despair, when I think we're most ready to commit to something big, when we're most ready to make a big change in our lives, when we're ready to take on something that's going to give us that purpose and meaning. So Liam and I, we were watching the news and we saw all these people, this is back in 2011, all these people were going to jail protesting this Keystone XL pipeline. And, you know, we thought we had some insights about oil and pipelines. We were living right in the heart of pipeline country and oil country. And Liam said to me, what if we hike every every single mile of that pipeline? What if we gain a voice that way? And I looked at him and dropped my potato soup bowl in the sink, and I said with what must have been this frightening excitement, we must. And that was the beginning of our expedition. So kind of after that, things started to look up for me a bit. I published my first book, Walden on Wheels, which has nothing to do with any of this. But that was the first time I had money in the bank. I was like, oh, what can I do with this money? And I thought about this expedition. So I hitchhiked at a dead horse, and things were looking up. But I wanted to consciously hold on to that flash of excitement I felt so intensely when Liam suggested it, because it's so easy to kind of forget about those moments. So I wanted to consciously hold on to it. Let me just read a quick passage from my book. So this is when I'm living in Denver, and Liam's still up in northern Alaska. Liam and I had stayed in touch all that time to discuss trip logistics. At first, the expedition, along with most of my other ideas, could have been listed under the category of things I fantasize about doing, but probably won't, but are fun to think about doing anyway. We had monthly phone conversations about the trip. It was clear that I was far more excited about the expedition than he was, but by the end of each conversation, he seemed to be re-energized and rededicated. I'd begun to wonder, though, if Liam had the frame of mind necessary to commit to such a long journey. For one thing, he began to question if it would be better to wait another year so we could properly prepare and save up enough money. More unsettling was the suggestion that we don't have to do the whole thing. We could hike for a bit, take some months off, and start again whenever we wanted to. Such suggestions were hardly unreasonable, but I'd read enough books on real-life journeys to appreciate how reasonableness isn't always a good trait for someone who's about to do something ultimately unreasonable. Still, I so wanted Liam to come. I knew he'd be the perfect traveling companion. He was kind, intelligent, a great cook. I pictured the two of us trudging across the lonely, wide-open prairie like Sam and Frodo on a long, perilous expedition. We'd take care of each other, lift each other up when we were down, and perhaps, like the hobbits in moments of utter hopelessness, hold hands in that tender, brotherly pre-20th century way. I imagined us on a journey of high adventure, escaping gunfire, taking cover from tornadoes, and maybe whispering in a moment of life or death suspense with the hushed tone of poised determination, run. So I started preparing. I've learned a thing or two about nutrition since then. But when you're about to go on a big hike, you want calorie-dense stuff. You're going to be expending a ton of calories. So yeah, Fritos, peanut butter, energy bars, stuff like that. Here I am mixing up a giant box of trail mix. So I'm boxing up all of my food. I box it up into about 5 or 6 days worth of food into each box. And then my buddy in Denver, he was mailing these boxes to post offices along my route. So mapping, I found some mapping online for the Keystone XL, just some government documents, but it wasn't good for navigation, so I bought this mapping software program called Topo, and I'd print out about 75 maps, so when I'm hiking across the prairie, I have a map in one hand and a compass in the other. Lots of small stuff here. I got chlorine dioxide. This would purify my water, med kit, bear spray, and jackknife, just in case. Headlamp, so I could see in the dark. And this portable solar charger, which actually didn't do anything. That was kind of a waste of money. So this is a tarp tent. This weighs like 1.5 pounds. It's so light because when you're going on a walk across a continent, you want to go as light as possible, and every ounce counts. You can feel all the weight on your back. And I had an iPad 3 and a keyboard and kind of a Pelican case because it was really important for me to be able to share this journey. So I was blogging about it. I was editing my photos on here. I was editing videos on here. I kind of wanted to be this almost like live streaming, roaming journalist. And I had a whole bunch of books on here. I had like 20, 25 books on my Kindle. So that's pretty much how I'd spend all my time in the tent, just reading these books. So here I am, ready to go. I got 45 pounds on my back. Just one problem. Liam remembered that he was banned from Canada for an offense he committed in his wayward youth, as he put it. So this journey was going to be a solo journey, sadly. So before I start my hike, I want to see something, and that's the tar sands of northern Alberta, because that's where the oil is coming from. So on a late September afternoon in 2012, I stick out my thumb and I begin hitchhiking 1,000 miles north to get to Fort McMurray. So before I get to there, let me tell you a little bit about the Keystone XL. So the northern terminus of the XL is up here in Hardisty, a little town in Alberta. It goes through Saskatchewan, Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, and then it enters into an already existing pipeline. This is called the Keystone 1, this kind of this orange-red one. This is in the ground. It's been in the ground since 2008, 2009. So the oil would go through here to Cushing, Oklahoma, and then the second part of the Keystone XL would be built from Cushing to Port Arthur. And in Port Arthur, there's a whole bunch of refineries, so you can refine this oil into diesel and other fuel-based products for shipment overseas. So the pipe is 36 inches in diameter, and like most all pipes, it would be buried entirely beneath the ground. What's flowing through these pipes? It starts off as this stuff. This stuff is called bitumen. Bitumen is a mixture of clay, water, sand, and oil, and it's in northern Alberta, up in this colored area here. So what you do is it's in the ground, it's beneath the forest, so you have to bulldoze the forest, and then you have to dig tens or hundreds of feet into the ground to scoop up all of this bitumen. And then on site, there's kind of refineries on site, so they use a whole bunch of fresh water from rivers to boil it, and then they add chemicals like benzene, and what they're trying to do is separate the oil from the rest of the gunk. So then you have diluted bitumen, otherwise known as dilbit. Dilbit is what would be running through the Keystone XL. Dilbit is running through a number of pipelines as we speak right now. So I want to see the tar sands. I want to see this place because I've heard about it. But the thing is, you can't see it when you're on the ground. You have to be above it. So I buy this $200 tour flight over the area, and I'm flying over the area, and this is all boreal forest. It's gorgeous country. And then I begin to fly over this enormous tailings pond, or more like tailings lake. So this refining process, they built these man-made lakes, and this is where all the non-oil gunk goes. And kind of the creepy thing about these is ducks often land on these thinking it's just good water, and they pretty much immediately die. So they've posted scarecrows in these lakes dressed up in hazmat suits, and they call them bitu men. It's creepy stuff. So then I'm flying over these like soccer ball fields of coke. This is pet coke or petroleum coke. It's a pure carbon. It comes out of that initial refining process, and this stuff can be burned as a secondary fossil fuel, much like coal, and it's also really nasty stuff. And then I'm flying over these really strange yellow sulfur pyramids. Sulfur comes out of that initial refining process, and they don't know what to do with it, so they're just building these yellow pyramids up into the sky. Again, just really eerie stuff. And this is pretty much what I see from above. from one edge of the earth to the next, just this giant mud pit. And the pilot dropped us off, and I said to the pilot, wow, that was huge. And he says, you know, we only saw 10, in this hour-long flight, we only saw 10% of the pit mining operations. And pit mining is only 50% of the extraction methods used to the tar sands. So what we're talking about in the tar sands is perhaps the worst man-made environmental disaster in human history. That may not be an exaggeration. So I start walking. And this is where I start. This is the Alberta prairie. There's no finer ground for walking than the prairie. It's nice, hard ground, rolling. Sometimes you step on a small cactus. Sometimes you get grass seed in your socks, but otherwise it's wonderful walking. And the goal is to get south as fast as possible, because I'm starting in late September in Canada, and it's going to be winter soon in Montana, so I figure, you know, do 20 miles a day, get this thing done in 100 days, and, you know, escape winter. By day 3, my feet were just an absolute mess. At one point, I had 8 blisters on the bottoms of my feet. I had gashes on the backs of my ankles. I had athlete's feet on the tops of both. This is gross, I know, but athlete's feet on the tops of my feet. And then a shin splint injury. Has anyone had a shin splint? Yeah, a couple people. You know how awful they are. And I remember I got to this town in Saskatchewan, Shaunavon, and I just couldn't walk anymore. And I went to the library, and I'd end up sleeping in this abandoned RV park for 5 nights trying to recuperate. And I remember I was sitting in the library just trying to cross my legs, like to pick up my leg like this, and it was so agonizing. And I thought, how am I going to walk across a continent when I can't even fold my legs? So I'm walking in an almost constant state of fear. I'm terrified of all these landowners. You know, I'm trespassing across their property. Are they going to, you know, be upset with me? I'm terrified of winter coming, and I'm terrified of all these cows. So beforehand, when I was hitchhiking from Denver to Alberta, I got picked up by this rancher. Her name was Doris in Montana. And I was like, okay, someone who really knows cattle out here. I can ask her all my cow questions. And I asked Doris, what do I do if a cow charges me? And she said this. She said, just look them in the eye and talk to them manly. And when she saw that I wasn't the sort who's going to look them in the eye or talk to them manly, she said, when they charge, just step to the side of them, tire them out like that. That's not what you want to hear before a trip like this. But I'm also figuring stuff out, too. I'm learning how to navigate. So the Keystone, so I found the Keystone 1 pipeline. The Keystone 1 parallels the Keystone XL for a little bit. So I'd see these signs saying this is the Keystone pipeline. I'd see the mile marker. I could see these signs from pretty far off. Or you know, when you have electrical lines and you have like one of those red balls kind of in an electrical line above a street, that usually indicates that there's a pipeline beneath the ground. So I'd see those red balls from miles away, so I knew I could just head towards that and always stay on like a really nice, tight, southeasterly course. Because when these pipelines are under the ground, you can't tell where the pipeline is or where it's not, so you really need navigational tools like this. So this is the prairie. It's like nothing like Maine. It's nothing like Massachusetts. There's hardly any woods out there. You have to imagine yourself standing on these grasslands where you look around and you rarely see homes. You rarely see electrical lines. You rarely see roads. And you rarely see trees sometimes. So I would always try to camp in trees, but sometimes this is as many trees as I could find. to have a concealed camping spot. The wind, it just blows so hard over the plains because there's no forest, there's no hills to kind of block it. So one time in Montana, I used this abandoned shack as a kind of a windbreak. Once I got hit by a blizzard in South Dakota, so I slept in this abandoned barn for a couple of nights. And the cows, they actually weren't so bad. And I know some of you think it's ridiculous that I was scared of these cows, but put yourself in my shoes for a second. You're going to have to hop that barbed wire fence and then walk right through that herd many times a day. It's a little scary. So typically, they'd be kind of out in the pasture. Say like there'd be 50 of them, and they'd all be munching on grass. And you know, I'm just walking towards them with my trekking poles. And then one of them just kind of pops its head up and just starts staring at me in mid-chew, and it's got all this grass coming out the side of its mouth. And then all 50 of them are just staring at me as I'm marching towards them. And then one is just a really big scaredy cat and just starts running away. And then all 50 join the stampede, and they're just running away. And you know, here I am, 175 pounds, scaring away 50,000 pounds. It always made me feel really powerful. So for water, I'd get water from any natural resource I could, whether it's ponds, lakes, rivers. Again, the plains are very arid. In fact, in the 1800s on American maps, it was called the Great American Desert. So finding natural sources of water was difficult, but I relied on these things quite a bit. These are called Windmill Springs, and at first I just thought they were like decoration for the prairie. I didn't know what these things even did. And I heard a few chuckles, and I know there's people in here who have no idea what these things do, so let me explain. The wind blows, there's a pump, and it's pumping up water from the ground, pumps it into a trough, and that's where all the cows drink out of, and that's where I drank out of quite a bit. But when there were no natural resources, I'd go knocking on doors, and I'd say once a day or once every other day, I'd knock on someone's door and ask for water. And this was my opportunity to talk with folks about pipelines and climate change and environmentalism and stuff like that. This guy, Carl, he's from Alberta, and he pointed to his field, and he said, the Keystone 1 is going through my property. That pipeline's the best thing that's ever happened to me. He was generously compensated, you know, $10,000, $20,000. He said it gave a brief local boost, a boost to the local economy. It had yet to rupture. This was the sort of feeling I got from folks in Canada, Alberta and Saskatchewan, because Alberta is kind of the Texas of Canada. It's so much of their economy relies on the oil industry. So pipelines, oil, it's all a really normal thing. It's not a controversial thing. Of course, there's pockets of resistance, but especially in rural Canada, it's just not a big deal. Once I crossed the border into the US, though, I began to see some resistance to this pipeline. And again, this pipeline wasn't in the ground. This was just a proposed pipeline at the time, on the grounds of private property. So someone would tell me, yeah, like my great-granddaddy homesteaded this land, and now this foreign corporation wants to jam a pipeline through it. No way. So that upset a number of people just on the private property point of view. And it wasn't until Nebraska where I saw some environmental resistance to it. I met this guy. His name's Rick Hammond. He's a cowboy and a farmer. He grows corn and soybeans, and he's got about 100 head of cattle. And he was not happy at all about the Keystone XL because it was set to go through his family's land. And he thought he could join me on my walk for the rest of Nebraska to kind of drum up a whole bunch of negative publicity. And sure enough, it worked. Like, we were being interviewed by local radio, local TV, local newspapers, every single day. And eventually we'd make the New York Times, Huffington Post, Mother Jones. We were on Canada's top news station. So, like, my little trip was working. You know, it wasn't lighting the internet on fire or anything, but you know, it was getting the Keystone XL out there. It was furthering the conversation a little bit. It was creating just a little bit more awareness behind the issues of this pipeline. I should say, too, that, like, by this point in the walk, like, I don't know about you, but I'm often in a state of existential anxiety. It's just like, what am I doing with my life? Am I spending it the right way? Should I go be a nurse? Should I become a teacher? But it was like these 4.5 months of walking, it was complete existential serenity. It was like all of those thoughts just kind of went away, and I think it was just because I was doing what I loved. I was walking, and I was writing, and I was doing something I believed in. I was trying to tackle an issue I was really curious about. And even though, you know, rural South Dakota is considered the middle of nowhere, I thought I was right in the center of the universe, because this was a huge fight that was deeply symbolic between industry and environmentalism. But let me go back to talking with folks and getting their impressions. And first of all, like, you have no idea how many times people said I was going to get shot for doing what I was doing. I'd hear that in every bar or restaurant I went into. Like, you're going to get shot for walking on so-and-so's land. And that would make me really rethink private property. And ask, if we have some time, ask me about that, because I wrote my latest book just on this subject. But with regard to the pipeline, this really surprised me, most people were just completely indifferent to it. You know, I came from my liberal, environmental East Coast bubble where this was a big issue. But out here, when it's going through people's lands, like, even they were just, like, really indifferent to it. It's like, yeah, you know, I'll take the money. Yeah, this is kind of how things are done. And when I bring up topics like climate change, I'd often be told that that was a left-wing hoax or a liberal conspiracy. And it made me really think about climate change denial, because there were so many climate change deniers on my walk. And we can talk about this some more if you want later, but just to name one reason why I think there's a lot of denial out here is, you know, when you're walking the Great Plains, you see abandoned homes, you see ghost towns all over the place. Back in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, the population of the Great Plains was actually much higher than it was. There was a huge exodus, largely because of agricultural technologies making people obsolete. There was just too many people on the plains. So when you're walking past all these abandoned places, the people are aware of their town's mortality. This town could become a ghost town any year. So when you have a pipeline company saying, yeah, we're going to build a new soccer ball field, yeah, we're going to bring in a whole bunch of money, even if just temporarily, yeah, we're going to supply some jobs, even if temporarily, they're going to go for those temporary benefits rather than worrying about some faraway thing like climate change, which to many people is just an abstract concept. So I really understood that from their point of view. And also, on the plains per capita, per person, consume more fossil fuels than anyone in the country. And that's because if you want to get anywhere, you have to drive really far. There's no public transportation. Like, for one high school football team to play another high school football team, that could be a couple hundred miles of driving. Or just industrial agriculture, the amount of fossil fuels used for combines and tractors and all of that stuff. No one really wants to admit to themselves that their lifestyle is contributing to this huge problem. So I think sometimes it's just easier to take on this stance of apathy or denial. And I'm not saying that's right at all, but I think those may be factors behind it, just to understand it. So when I crossed the border into the U.S., I just walked a few hundred miles, and I no longer felt like a stranger on the prairie. You know, rather I began to feel at home on this simple, beautiful, unappreciated landscape. Every night I'd hear coyotes outside of my tent. Every day I saw these huge herds of deer and pronghorn just soaring across the prairie. There'd be like 50 of them just all flying across the prairie and just elegantly leaping over barbed wire fences. In Saskatchewan, once I saw about 5,000 ducks ascend from a hayfield and begin to swirl in the sky like a tornado about to touch down. Or the clouds. The plain sky is just so huge. These are just like moving mountain chains sailing across this deep blue sky. And you know, even though the plains are in the middle of one of the busiest, loudest, most populous countries in the world, it's one of those last few places where you can go to feel truly and utterly alone, and I mean that in a good way. Like out there, you are just this solitary skiff on this ocean of grass. And I think about when Liam suggested we go hike the Keystone XL way back in Dead Horse. And, you know, that was a crazy idea. And, like, I think we all know what it's like to get a crazy idea. Maybe not to go on a long walk, but to write a book or go to live in a foreign country. I don't know. But we all have them. And I think because they're crazy, they're so easy, it's so easy to come up with reasons why you can't do them, why they can't be done. But I've learned from this experience and other experiences that we have these flashes of inspiration for good reason. You know, maybe they represent some aching existential need that we haven't quite fulfilled yet. And I don't think you can go wrong following through with these dreams, because how could you go wrong when some inner part of you is just clamoring for something? You know, I've learned not to think of those flashes of inspiration as crazy ideas, but think of them as messages from fate, calling upon you to do something big, something grand. So let me just finish by just reading a passage. And this is in the middle of South Dakota. I'm kind of like right in the middle of my walk here, the center point. So the prairie was as desolate as ever. I couldn't see any homes, and I crossed a rarely traveled gravel road every few miles. I hopped a barbed wire fence into a cow pasture and casually walked up to a herd of black Angus cows. These cows, I observed, weren't running away from me as they normally would. I yelled, "Get out of here, cows," and waved my poles in the air, trying to freak them out. But they only moved a few yards to the left and right, creating a narrow corridor, which I had no choice but to walk through. The land was flat, except for a gentle downward slope that led to a creek that had dried up. I walked down the slope, and in the grassy creek bed, there was another dozen cows staring at me. The cows that I had just passed had gathered and were following me down the hill. I had moving cows behind me and motionless cows in front of me. My heart thumped. My pulse raced. I became unseasonably sweaty. I'd just taken a hit of adrenaline. All the pains and sores that I had been walking with were completely forgotten, and I now had one and only one aim: get away from these cows. I was surrounded, and then I heard it. It was a rolling thunder. I looked back for a moment, one blip of a second, and caught a glimpse of the most terrifying, amazing, makes my legs wobbly thing I'd ever set my eyes on. It was a tidal wave of muscle pouring down the hill, a horde of black Angus cows just 10 yards behind me, their hooves launching tufts of grass into the air, their huge bodies moving across the treeless prairie in a thunderous, ground-shaking roar. The worst of my fears had come true. I was being attacked by cows. There was only one word on my mind, which communicated itself to me in a not-so-hushed tone of not-so-poised determination. Run. Thank you. Thank you. You guys have any questions?
And thank you, Ken, for an inspiring, terrifying adventure. Did it get you?
Obviously not. I survived.
Are there any questions?
So when the pipeline is slated to cross private property, what's the process by which owners of that private property get compensation? Like you talked about the man in Alberta who got, $10,000, $20,000. Do they just get a quote from the pipeline company and just accept it, or do they have any negotiation in that?
Did I pass the map of the Keystone XL? I think there it is. So it crosses all private property. It doesn't go through any public property. It doesn't go through any national parks, national forests. This is all private property. And I don't know how many landowners, but a few thousand at least. It goes through a few thousand people's land. So what TransCanada, that's the company that owns the Keystone XL, they send land agents to each landowner. Like they'll go up to the door and knock on the door. And these people are very charismatic. They're very charming, but they're also deceptive and duplicitous. And I'd hear this over and over again from the landowners I spoke with. So they make the landowner sign a non-disclosure contract, which means that each landowner doesn't know how much his neighbor is being compensated or being compensated at all. So someone who signs, say you have 10 acres of land in Montana, pipes going through those 10 acres, and say that same thing is happening in Texas. You have no idea how much that person in Texas is getting, or even your neighbors. And when you say, I'm not sure I want this, I don't know if I like this pipeline, the thing I heard was that they kept threatening, well, we're going to anyways. We're using eminent domain. So if you don't sign this contract now and don't take your $10,000, you're not going to get anything. So my friend Rick, remember the guy who joined me for about 4 days? He did just that. He felt overly pressured. He felt all alone. The local lawyers, they've never dealt with anything like this, so you can't get good legal advice. So he signed, and he regrets it to this day. So that's how they do it. But just to kind of expand on that and give you kind of the last few years' history of the Keystone XL. The Keystone XL is still not in the ground. President Obama rejected it. He formally rejected it right before he left office. But one of the first things President Trump did when he got in was resurrect it from the dead. It's currently in an environmental review process now, and just last week, pipes began to be shipped to the state of Montana. So here again is the Keystone XL. So pipelines typically, they don't need presidential approval. If you're just going from North Carolina to South Carolina, that can just be done with minimum approval. But because the Keystone XL crosses an international border, it needs State Department or presidential approval. So this section here, there's not 1 inch of this that's in the ground right now. But this second half from Cushing to Port Arthur, that is in the ground, and that's running other oils from other pipelines coming in. So this is the section that's very contentious right now, and we can probably expect to see more big fights, sort of similar to what we saw with the Dakota Access Pipeline that went over Lakota territory last year or a year and a half ago.
It sounds like you learned a lot about yourself on the trip when you were talking about all the existential thoughts you had. What was the one moment that you thought you learned the most about yourself along your trip?
Well, it was You know, you would think that walking across the country would make you think more highly of yourself, but that first month was actually extraordinarily humbling. Like, I thought like I was a really athletic person and I was unstoppable, but again, when you can't lift your legs across your legs, it just really humbles you. And thereafter that, I just kind of, when someone has an injury, when someone's broken an arm, like I feel you. So there's that. But I'd say one thing this trip did for me was it made me think differently about America, Americans. You know, I kind of went in this as like a cynic, someone who loves nature, but a misanthrope at the same time. But when you're walking every day and you're interacting with perfect strangers and you knock on someone's door and they give you water, and then they say, hey, do you want to come in for dinner? And you're sitting them having dinner at the table, and then they say, do you want to just sleep on the couch for the night? Or when you're walking along a road and someone stops and just holding a pocket full of money. That must have happened at least 6 times. Just someone pulled over, holding money out for me, thinking I was homeless. Or this one time in Oklahoma, I was walking along roads again, and this truck went past me, and 20 minutes later it came back holding a bag of McDonald's. And he went all the way out just to get me breakfast. So yeah, we have America on the news. We have America that we read in the New York Times and Fox News, and just the madness and mayhem of Washington. And sometimes I think it's easy to think like that's America, but that's not how I see America after this trip. I think of America as that time that guy in Oklahoma tried to give me a bag of McDonald's. Unbelievable kindness and generosity along the way.
I have a follow-up question on that, about the interactions with the people you met and the conversations you had. You mentioned a couple of them that seemed very positive. Do you have a feeling that that was the overall interactions towards you? Were they mostly acceptant, or were they wondering why you were doing that?
Yeah.
Or also, when contentious issues like climate change came up, what was your approach? And also, what do you think we need to do to bring those people on board?
Yeah.
A lot of questions.
So yeah, everyone was really nice to me, and I could only think of maybe 1 or 2 situations where I got real impoliteness. And it's true that I feel really heartened and encouraged by seeing just the generosity of the American people, but when you try to interact with them and talk with them about environmentalism and climate change, it was almost the opposite. Like, I became even more upset and cynical about that, because when you hear climate change denial over and over again, and they're just like conservative radio talking points, because I hear the same thing whether it was in Oklahoma or South Dakota, it was really disillusioning. And I don't think I ever convinced someone about climate change, and you know, that's something I had to deal with because I don't have a scientific background. It's not easy talking about like ice core data or carbon emissions. Like, I can't marshal those facts quick enough in a conversation, and I'd always feel inadequate after. It's like, oh, I could have said this, but it almost doesn't matter. Like, you can't convince someone with facts. But there was a few times when I did connect with them. Climate change, environmentalism, these are dirty words out there. So I remember I was in Texas, and this one guy says, are you one of those environmentalists, in kind of this condescending way? And I said, yeah. And I said, let me explain to you why. You know, I grew up in Niagara Falls, New York. 4 miles north of my home is this place called Love Canal, where in the 1950s, this chemical company, the Hooker Chemical Company, they buried a bunch of toxic waste into the ground. And in the 1970s, children were being born with extra rows of teeth, unprecedented cancer and epilepsy rate. People were dying. And now when you go to Love Canal, it's this eerie town where there's no homes. It's all blocked off. There's a whole bunch of barbed wire around it. I grew up seeing what happens when industry gets its way. I grew up being an environmentalist, partly because of that. So when I told that story, he said, okay, I got it. You know, he understood it. So if you can bring it to family, if you can bring it to health, if you can bring it to your own personal experience, I think that can go a far way towards talking with folks about big environmental issues that would otherwise disagree with you.
Well, I walked that way, just as a side note. Lois Gibbs, the activist behind Love Canal, was here last year to give a talk, and all the documents related to that are hosted at the TAP's archives and digital collection, so if you're interested, you should consult them.
I'm just curious, based on that anecdote and just what you were talking about climate change denials earlier, do you think that, or what like systematic changes do you think could be made on a bigger scale to help people in those positions to understand the climate crisis better?
I guess the question is, how can we break through to these people somehow, right? I don't know. Like, at one point I had this really cynical position, and maybe I still do. It's called the Planck principle, and it's a principle regarding scientific breakthroughs. And this guy, Planck, said, breakthroughs don't come by because when you have a scientific breakthrough, it's really hard to convince your scientific colleagues about it. Scientific breakthroughs don't come from convincing your colleagues. It comes from the next generation of scientists growing up with this new fact. In other words, people need to die out, and people need to grow up believing something else. And maybe that's the case here. I don't know. And when I did talk to folks about it, they said it's just not a part of our lives. It's something we've never seen before, and therefore it's something kind of hard to believe in. And the people of the Great Plains, they're not worried about sea levels rising, or they're not worried about hurricanes or anything like that. They are worried about a little bit about drought, but drought has been on the plains for millennia. But I think it is possible, because when you think of a few examples, like there's this one book called Clandestine Relationships, and it's written by this African-American man, and he would go and meet with KKK leaders, and he would have conversations with them. And he got, I don't know, half a dozen KKK leaders to turn in their robes. And he said he did this by just speaking with them honestly and respectfully. And once they had this conversation with this African-American man, they couldn't go on doing what they were doing. Or just as another example, when you look at something as embedded in us as religion, Catholic Church scandals in Ireland, or this area, you know, the Catholic Church is leaving a lot of people's lives, and these are just examples of people changing their identity in very real ways. And I think maybe one of the biggest problems out in rural America is this hardy individualist myth that kind of everyone carries. You know, I moved out here, I planted these crops, my daddy built this home, I'm self-reliant, I'm independent, I don't need big government in my life. So when that identity hits something as big as climate change, it is a weird, ugly clash, because climate change threatens all of that. Because if you admit to man-made climate change, you're saying, okay, we need a big government that's going to help control this. We're going to need to combine with nations around the globe. We're going to need international treaties. We're going to need to keep these resources in the ground and not get them. A lot of these things don't fit that hardy individualist myth. So I think a question for someone, I don't have the answer to this, is how do you bring climate change into that hardy individualist myth? Do we try to just get that kind of identity out, or do we work with it in some way? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Hi, you were talking about how you were really frightened about the cows. and you mentioned that a lot of people were saying you're going to get shot, which personally to me the shot thing is a little bit more frightening because I'm comfortable around cows. So I appreciate the difference in point of view. But did you ever encounter anyone, I don't know at what point you spoke with Leno or got some of this larger publicity, I think you were talking about early on when you were in the northern part. Did you have people go, oh, you're that guy? And did this help you feel safer that your story was out there?
Yeah. In Nebraska, I felt like a complete celebrity. By the time I got to like my story had somehow gone viral on this Facebook group. So I walked to this big meeting about the Keystone XL. It was just amazing that I was walking through this town and they were having like this huge statewide meeting. It was so fortuitous. And I walk in there and someone screams, "It's the pipeline walker." And they all crowd around me and someone brought a big jug of Ogallala water and like buffalo jerky. Everyone was just like giving me things. And then the moment I walked into Kansas, I was just an anonymous bum again. Someone pulled over and they said, what did they say? Are you a drifter or something like that? So yeah, in Nebraska it felt great. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a little more about the cows because it seems like when you probably started out, you looked at them as part of nature, or the good side, or did you see them as allies of the pipeline builders, the bad guys? So, and how did it change, and how do you resolve your relationship with cows now?
So first of all, there are cow-related fatalities on average 14 times a year in America. So if one has bovophobia, that's a completely reasonable phobia. And I looked at the statistics, and 90% of the time it's a man, 77% of the time it's a white guy. So I had this like target right on my butt the whole time. First of all, the cows living out there, they're actually living really good lives. I mean, they don't have many predators. It's a beautiful country. The ranchers really do care about the animals until they get to the feedlots. But when they're out in the country, it's pretty good lives. So when I finished my journey and I pitched a publishing company, can I do a travel book on this? I got a book deal. And I thought, you know, I need to be on the Great Plains to write this, because at the time I was living in North Carolina. So I moved to Rick's house, the guy who walked with me, and I was living on his property there. And I became his helper. So I was helping sort calves from the mother cows. I was on an ATV kind of herding cows. So I got really used to it, and my fears completely went away, you know.
Any other questions?
Yep, got one over here.
Can you talk a little bit more about your book about private property?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. Okay, so this is book number 1, Walden on Wheels, about my 5-year journey of paying off my student debt, and then I went to Duke University and didn't have a way of affording it, so I secretly lived in this red van on campus for 2 years. So this is kind of a get out of debt and then stay out of debt journey. And then the book I just talked about, Trespassing Across America, that's kind of what I just discussed. And this one just came out this April. This is called This Land is Our Land. So in this book, I was interested in private property because, you know, having just trespassed across America just makes you think about private property for the first time in your life. But I only talked about it for like 2 pages. It was like, I could talk about this for ages. So I pitched my publishing company, what about a story in which I advocate for the right to roam? In countries like Scotland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they have laws essentially called the right to roam, where you are allowed to go onto private people's property and hike and camp and birdwatch and swim and paddle a canoe It's unbelievable. And I live in Scotland right now, and I exercise my right to roam all the time. So in this book, I call for an American right to roam, so it's kind of like this radical manifesto. And some of the research I did was so fascinating. Like, I researched American history, the history of private property in America, and it's so dynamic and different, this no trespassing culture that we're used to. It didn't exist. It didn't exist up until about the Civil War. And I examined Scotland, Sweden, England. Yeah, so that's my work there. So if I know you guys are cash strapped, but if you are interested in the book, I'm selling them for $15 each or $40 for all three, and I can take Venmo if you're interested.
Okay, let's thank him one more time.
Okay.